Hi, my name is Emin Blanco, and today we'll be talking about how comics have impacted our society in a lot of different ways that we might have not even noticed. In order to see how comic books have impacted us, we have to look at the history, their origin, how they began. And it's actually quite easy, quite simple. Comic books started off as comic book strips, like that. And they started to gain popularity around the 1938 and the 1940s. In fact, they started off as wartime propaganda for World War II. And some of the heroes we know and love today, like Captain America, pretty obvious one, Superman, and Wonder Woman, were used as propaganda during the war. For example, Wonder Woman was supposed to represent the woman's new active and changing role in society and in the war, and how they were supposed to still maintain their femininity while being active, and while changing their new role and their new status in the war. Captain America, however, a little more obvious, red, white, blue, stars. Obvious, as you can tell, he was supposed to represent Americans' patriotism. He was supposed to make us feel proud to be American and enlist in the war. And after the war ended, comics started to go into a new route. They started to create their own stories while still addressing some real world issues, like the civil rights movement. And as of today, 2020, comic books still do that. They address real world issues while creating their own stories. Going back to something we talked about in the history, which is the civil rights movement, which actually is an impactful and very meaningful part of our history, also has an allegory in the Marvel Universe, with that being the X-Men, and with Martin Luther King Jr. being represented by Professor Xavier and Malcolm X being represented by Eric Lensher, Magneto. They both want the same thing. They both want equality. They both want to stop the oppression and the segregation of their people, except that they both have different ideas and they both have different ideologies of how to get there, with Martin Luther King and Professor Charles Xavier being more peaceful and nonviolent, and Malcolm X and Eric Lensher Magneto being more realistic and doing whatever it takes to get there. This just shows how comics have and still have deep and meaningful stories. They talk about serious issues, and they still do. They talk about issues that affect the normal people, and they still affect us. They give us the representation we deserve, even if you might not be able to always see it. Another important topic that needs to be discussed while talking about the impact that comics have had in our society is discussing the influence they had in pop culture. So comics started to gain like a mainstream audience around the 20th century, the late 20th century, but they started to gain more popularity, like in general, around the 2000s when they started to develop their own cartoons, their own shows, their own movies, with actually the X-Men pioneering the comic book movies, which will later be taken over by the Marvel Cinematic Universe and have the highest grossing film of all times, Avengers Endgame, and with DC paving the way for comic book shows with Smallville in 2001. So nowadays, without even realizing, comic book movies and comic book properties in general are integrated in our society. When we talk about movies, comic book movies will always be or talked about in one way or another, about their visual effects, about their story, about how much money they made. Just the same with shows. They've been so ingrained that we now don't even consider it something new or something out of the norm, which would have not been the way back then in like the early 20th century. When comics started to gain popularity, you would have never imagined a comic book being adapted into the big screen, into Hollywood. So in a way, comic books have changed the way the industry works. They've actually changed the way the movie industry works, with revolutionizing the CGI and the effects that are used in movies and changing the way we view them as a whole. If there's anything I want to take away from this is that comics have impacted our society in big ways, like revolutionizing the movie industry and how we view it and the effects and how much money can be made from movies, to small ways like representing those who are represented, which maybe you wouldn't have thought is important or impactful, but is and can be impactful. So at the end of the day, comics are more than just superheroes fighting. They're more than just images and text. They're hope, representation. They're they're a source of literature where we can find meaningful and impactful stories. They're a way to just let loose and just remember at the end of the day, comics do impact us. They impact one person, many people, and maybe they can impact you if you give them a chance.